you left it, you picked up somebody else's canoe in the next spot, and you went across. And that's how your travel was. They went all the way from the Columbia River. Several.
She's getting it.
She's getting sorry. I don't know why. This is the first time I've ever been up and somebody said, phone boy. And it's just, but anyway, you could go to Columbia, come up through Bear River, come up through Little Harbor, pick up over to Grace Harbor, go up Grace Harbor, go up to Black River, go clear to Puget Sound. All trade routes that they had. You used canoes, you did what you packed where you had the portage, and the whole system it worked for them. And it was a different time, because I know they talk about the white people used to go so frustrated. Because the Chinook would take off and they would paddle their canoes like mad. And the white people, of course, were going someplace. They had a schedule. And all of a sudden they'd come past a point and they'd say, oh, and they'd stop. And they had younger people in the canoe. They would sing songs, they would tell stories. This took place here, this was Spirit is here. And then they'd go on again, paddle like mad, then stop. White men didn't travel that way, but that's the way the Indians traveled. That's what we did. We had foods. You know, when I was a kid, there were still people that didn't have a job. They lived off the land. One old fellow I know did very well. He was a government trapper. He did cast care of bark, he did fish, he did whatever he needed, made a very good living. I used to laugh and say, you know, you could fall off a log and have food here. And you could if you knew what the time was like. Things have changed, of course. The fish had gone down, there's not that. There's, my dad was in Alaska when he was young, came down. An old Indian in British Columbia offered him a boat if he would fish it for him because he had no sons. My dad says, I'd do better setting chokers down in Washington. I can't do that. He got down here, it was the middle of the Depression. I mean, the Depression broke while he was on the boat. He had no idea. So it was virgin country. He went out and peeled, him and his cousin peeled cascara bark for several, well, 2-3 years there. And made a better wage than they could set chokers. But it was all virgin country. No one else had done it. My grandfather was a pioneer logger. He was logging up North River. Whenever they needed anything, they went back to camp, bought their beans, whatever they needed, and then back out in the woods. Can't do that anymore. But that's... And then the other thing was, the population of the Indians at one time was huge. Lewis and Clark, they said, one of the main things that Lewis and Clark brought back, which we don't realize, is what the heck are we going to do with all these Indians? Seriously. They were used to the Plains Indians, where tribes were moving around. You could kind of control. These were urban populations. These were people that had towns, they had traditions, and you weren't going to move in there and take it over like you did. Well, they did eventually, but that was because of diseases is why it happened, that they were able to do that. But don't think of it that way, but that's the way it was. I worked on the dig down there on the Columbia, and you were talking about the baskets and things disappearing. We had, the thing that saved it is they said there was an old milk shed, and the floor had been there ever since early 70s. And they said, now, we're going to take that floor off, and we think that's where we'll find artifacts. Because what their problem was down there is they were finding places, but there was all these post holes. And there wasn't quite an order to them. Well, what they didn't realize is a good part of the population, to avoid the storms of the Columbia, just fished down there during the summer And then they wrapped all their planks on their houses up and moved up to Willapa Harbor where there was easier to get food and it was protected from the storms. But that's what was happening. It took a while for the archaeologists to finally realize what was going on. But we did find one plank off a plank under this shed. We found one plank off a plank house that had been burnt. One end of it was all there was left. It happened to be there was such a perfect print in the sand that for some reason, I don't know how, first time they dug through it, second time they found it. And here you had this print in the sand of the plank house. But things just didn't last. And, but we found knives and we found trade items in the village, and at the time that the house we had most likely was just after the time of the trading came in. So we had that type of thing. We had stuff from British Columbia, and there was even stuff from China, which didn't quite make sense because the currents went, trade went that way, but somehow it came back. Maybe from Hawaii, I don't know. Anyway. So there was that. Food, again, back to where I started again. Here's an interesting thing. I'm going to let you look at this. Do you want to pass that around? What I'm going to show you is salal berries that are 10 years old. And I know they are because I made the patty. And what they salal has a natural preservative. And what they did is they would make these conical baskets. They would put salal in the beaten salal in the bottom, and then they would put salmon, crushed up salmon in the top, another layer of salal, another layer of salmon, another layer of salmon, another layer of salal. And these baskets would last all winter. The food would last all winter. Also, they had shot berries, which lasted a long time. And then salmon run all winter up here. I mean, there was always something. Oysters, there was plants, and these people knew how to use all this. We've forgotten all that. But anyway, that was their food. We had, I think what else I'm going to read out something here. See, that's why I bring my wife home. But anyway, and besides that, they were traders. They traded, you know, they talked about buffalo meat down on the Columbia times. Yeah. And there weren't big buffalo down there. But anyway, the other thing happened is they had a way of farming. Now, the Europeans wouldn't have said it was farming. But up on Scarborough Hill, this part of it was called Red Hill for a while because they burned it off, and that's so the berries would grow. And I was on an archaeological dig there at Cathapoda, and that was, of course, upriver, but by Ridgefield. But it was very interesting because there was acorns bigger than what we have now. They found in the birds. There were elkhorns bigger than what we have now, by far. And it looks like they were farming, in the sense they were doing the cutting back the brush, they were making. The other thing they did, which wasn't exactly farming, but I read a very interesting book by a fellow that was in Cathlamet about 1830s, and very early. And he talked about, he says he wasn't sure whether these Indians were that good at tracking, or they just knew the routes of the deer and the elk ahead of time. And so if the elk started out this way, they know they could meet them down here. So again, that was kind of like farming. You know, you knew what it was, and that's the way that they worked. They had to have known something because they certainly survived for thousands of years here. Now, my family, they'd come along, we used to say, you know, yeah. My aunt used to say they were in the, you know, here to meet, they were here, and I said, half of them came in on the boat, the other half were here to meet the boat. So, and then of course, then you could go off on the canoes and all sorts of things, but yeah, we were here. So, I guess that's about it, about time, Cindy?
I think it's about time. You know, so far, I am so impressed because I gave them no answer. You've done good so far, Linda. It's all up to you.
No pressure. Okay, well, where to start? I didn't realize I had any Indian blood, Chinook, until I was, well, actually, I got more aware when we did the historical, the community historical at the museum when we started, that was started and I joined. And I realized my dad was, he came to want to be an Indian, let's put it that way, until later in life. He joined the Chinooks. He realized his upbringing from my grandmother, his grandmother, great-grandma, Louise, who actually talked Chinook jargon. She, my dad, once he started to talk about what this was all about, what, you know, his upbringing, and what we kind of remembered, he'd say his grandma Louise would take him down, they lived in Oakville, and right by the, of course, the Rochester, the Chehalis Indian Reservation. And she taught the native, the other, the Chehalis would come. Grandma would start talking to them in Chinook jargon. And so that to me just, well, and another thing with my dad and his father, they did not want to admit that they were Indian. They were, you know, wanted to pass as white. And my dad did that very successfully, pretty much, but this is my grandma. And we found this picture just recently, and those are braids, and his hair is down. I don't know if you want to pass it around. But that's my grandpa. I never knew my grandpa. He died when my dad was young. He was killed in a logging accident. But we're not quite sure the whole story behind that picture, but it was quite a revelation to my sisters and I that, oh my, wait, you know, and that's just my grandpa. So this is my dad, of course, but see, like talking about passing for white, you know, I love my dad, but they lived right next to the Chehalis reservation. So, you know, it was, I would presume, I know my grandmother, she was very against the Indian, our heritage with the Indians. So, my dad's mother. And so I know that was a big influence on him too. But as we have come to know, there's, you know, we are related, and I'm sorry, I muffed this so bad, and Jean tried to help me. But we are direct descendants of James Scarborough and Haley, his Indian wife. She was a daughter of Kamakami, and of course, how proud we are of this whole, and recently, when we started the museum's heritage, historian, I started looking, and I had no idea. I think my sister Carla had done some research at one time, but I didn't know anything. So this goes, James, this is my great-great-great-grandma, Haley, who was Kamakami, was her name, and then Edwin, who was their son. You may know James was killed. Hallie died, maybe because they had like 8 kids or something, I don't know. And James died. Of course, a lot of stories about, Scarborough Hill. He supposedly had gold buried there. And I almost think when he died, it could have been somebody up there trying to find the gold, because they dug up there for years and years. So after his death, it was fortunate that my direct descendant, Edward's son, James and Hallie's son, there was a guardian that had been appointed. James had a will, and his name was Bernie, and he actually took my grandpa and his other brother, great-great-grandpa, he took him to Cathlamet, and that's where they were raised. He was raised, and they lived there. He was a successful fisherman. In fact, he invented, and I found that, invented the salmon wheel. He had it, I don't even know, that's not even legal, but now. Anyway, next, and then his offspring was Sarah Scarborough. Actually, Sarah Farron was her name. This is where we get into intermarriage with the French Canadians, and they're, looking back on all my Indian heritage, this is just about the time when Sarah was born. Of course, I can't read that, but this was the influx of so many Canadian fur traders and all those kind of people. So she married him, and then their child Louise married Leclerc, which is another fur trader. Fur trading, they all came from Ontario. So there's a lot of, and French, of course, because Louise's, my dad's grandma, her name, she married Leclerc. So there we get the Leclerc, and then my grandpa, Walter Thomas, you saw the picture of Walter Thomas, and then my dad, and me. It's been a journey trying to find all this and how I feel all about this. Is my grandma Sarah, by the way, in Cathlamet. She actually owned a house in Cathlamet, which was, as you could, it's a pretty pretty special about her. But anyway, I have a picture of her house. But where I'm at right now is talking about the Chinooks and their fight and their, you know, we all talk, I have white settlers everywhere in my family, you know? But what it means to me right now is my white settlers came here and they took everything, you know, they took the whole, in fact, the Chinooks, I know you know the stories about the Chinooks and how, you know, they died off and because of the, you know, all the things the white settlers did. And so now, right now trying to fight for recognition is really important to me. And let me just read one little thing from Tony Johnson, who's the current.
Yes.
Yeah, excuse me. Thank you. Our children are the descendants of chiefs, new makers, weavers, tool makers, orators, doctors, hunters, and fishermen. Descendants of a community pulled to the brink of extinction, pushed to the shadows of a great tree, alongside a road seldom traveled. I guess that this is my heritage, what I'm very proud of. Besides all my other who go way back, you know, I've gotten into them too, and I'll talk about them sometime. But and my grandpa, I don't know. What do you think?
Chinook.
Yeah. Okay, that's it.
Wow. We really picked the right people. I mean, really, thank you so much, all of you. And so I'm sure you have questions, comments, whatever, so let's have at it. Kathy?
What I want to ask Linda is, what do you think shifted your dad's consciousness with regard to
Well, we moved
embracing?
here.
I'm sorry?
We moved here. You know, I grew up here. Well, we came visiting here because my mother's parents lived here. We grew up coming to the beach. They lived in Seaview. And what shifted for my dad was when we moved here, he actually had cousins with Briggs, and there were powwows, and my dad slowly became aware, and he became proud of his Grandma Louise and Grandma Sarah, and the whole history. And so he realized that how important that was to him.
So proximity, coming back.
Coming back, it really was, although they lived in Oakville, but he remembers Calf Lambert very well. And Skamakaway, and, looking at go ahead.
Quick comment about that. My great aunts were teachers in Portland all of their lives, and my Aunt Ruby looked like Alpha Mox. I could never understand why she always had such a good tan. She was so dark-skinned, not Aunt Mitty, but Aunt Ruby was. In the public schools, they could not identify that they were of ethnic background. So it was a hidden thing. It was very, very hidden, and that was why people didn't acknowledge that they had it mother in Seattle and say, I think I'm getting Indian background, how can I find out about it? Because our family avoided it. And then on my side of the family, my dad was a member, his mother, my grandmother, member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Okay. We had the polar opposite. And my grandmother almost never really accepted my mother, who looked completely white, as to why she, her Indian backgrounds. And she was in 1950 on the Chinook Tribal Council. So she was very active, very political. But, you just didn't talk about it. For a lot of families, it wasn't something that you talked about.
We have the same thing.
Yeah.
My grandmother was the youngest in the family, and her next oldest sister ran away from home for a bad marriage, a lot of different reasons. And we didn't know what happened to her. And finally, we ended up with, I don't know how many cousins, but we finally found, but anyway, she ran away. She went to Eastern Oregon, and she told us she was Spanish. She was Mexican. Because people didn't admit they were Indian at that time.
And another thing too is that if you are on tribes around the rest of the country, it's done by blood. So if you're like an eighth or something, you are then a member of the tribe, and after that you're not. We do by inheritance. I have my grandmother's Spencerian handwriting showing all of my lineage back to Concombre. And it's one of those things that I have the lineage, I can prove it, I don't look it. So it's hard for people. And my mother collected Indian artifacts all of her life, and it didn't matter if it was Seminole, Alaskan, Mexican, it was indigenous, it had to be collected. So if you ever come to my bed and breakfast, I'd give you a tour. I've got stuff all around. There's no place that really wants it because I've got, pottery and stuff that doesn't have any continuity, but she felt very strongly that it should be held and not just discarded.
And we drove across, we drove from Long Beach clear to Bar Harbor, Maine. And as you went across, you had a different timeline, you had a different individual stories, but the main thing was the same, all the way across all the tribes. You got to do the same thing. So it's interesting.
We have that too.
I just wondering why you use the term Chinook jargon rather than Chinook language?
Because it was a jargon. We had a Chinook language. That pretty much, it was from what I've read, it was a very difficult language. There was a fellow at the University of Washington who was trying to revive that. But the jargon was Chinook, 60%, and then French, Chinese on some of the words, whatever came in here, Hawaiian, it was all mixed up that way. And it was a little different maybe from one, like Ron has their version of it, maybe a little different someplace else, all the way. But where it survived was Grand Rock, because they took all of these tribes from all of Eastern Oregon, or Western Oregon, and put them in one spot, and they had talked to each other. So the first level, they were, that's your second language. The time the kids came along, it was their first language, and so they knew it there. That's one place that stayed for a long time. There's others, but Grand Juan's the one closest to us. And Tony, she talked about, worked on Grand Juan and did language stuff down there, so he's kind of helped really bring it back together. And there's some areas, now, I can't remember the website. There's a website. Wawa, okay. Wawa needs to speak. But it's on the web, you can get on you can learn it on the internet.
So, I've always understood, maybe this is wrong, that jargon was developed as a trade language.
Yes.
And not necessarily when whites or French or any of the whites came, but even among Indian tribes themselves.
Right.
Shared certain words so that they could trade effectively. And
It was.
Since
And
Chinooks were traders, years. That was their main thing.
Well, it was just, I always said, you know, the Columbia River was